have the pleasure and honor of introducing Jason Lane now, who comes to us from NOAA, National Fisheries Service, and where he's working as a program leader in the Food Web Dynamics program as a research fisheries biologist. His principal interest being fish feeding ecology, fisheries and ecosystem management, large aquatic marine ecosystems, pelagic communities, ecological modeling, and has been published widely. And for example, one paper with the title "Translation of Ecosystem Indicators into Decision Criteria." Thank you very much, Jason.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you to Tim and Andre for the invite. Before I start, can everyone hear me in the back of the room adequately? Okay. All right. Other things, before I jump into this, I want to acknowledge several of my colleagues and collaborators, some of whom are in the room, some of whom represent our postdocs. Folks like Bill Orwell, Michael Reed, Lee Tyrell, Hassan Mustafa, and so forth. They contribute a lot to this. The other thing I want to know before I start is that about 4:15, 4:20 local time, a lot of you were probably tired. I would guess a lot of you are probably having brain freeze of all the information today. So I at least should try to put in some funny pictures and some cute quotes. And I say that just so you'll pay attention to see those. So, about 6 or 7 years ago at a Multispecies Symposium, I flashed this slide. You know, we've been talking about ecosystem-based fisheries management. What in the wide world of sports does that mean? What are we trying to do? All these principles and blah, blah. And now we're in how. You know, I flagged this slide, as I said, half a decade ago or more. And it's interesting for me to revisit that question. How do we actually implement this from a global perspective, listening to all of you and the discussions we've had today, but also to go back in our system and situation and see how are we doing this? Where are we going? You know, how is it working? So what I like to do is give you a bit of conceptual underpinnings, talk about the scientific or technical basis of where I think we're putting a lot of our energies of how to do this, and then very briefly, and as best as I can, talk about some institutional, organizational type things and try to wrap that up and keep you all awake and paying attention to the quotes. So, this is the main theme. So I think we're really trying to address trade-offs in this whole business. And, you know, that's the text, but this is what it's all about. What you see here is we have Flipper, and then we can have fish burger, and really, you know, if this is the ecosystem, do we need to take a slice out of the pie instead of the side so Flipper is happy, and then maybe get a piece of the pie, coconut cream, by the way, and have that so that everybody can have a piece of the ecosystem sustainably, yada, yada, yada. So you get the point. That's what we're all about. And I think, here's a cool quote. I'm going to just say it's a cool quote that really underlies my philosophy. Have you read it? Yeah. Keep on. All right. So anyways, the thing that's important from my perspective before we start is there's three kinds of management advice. There's Heurism, you know, understand how ecosystems function, the structure, that type of thing. Understand the relative importance of different processes. We've talked about triage of you know, bottom up, top down, oceanography versus fishing, ecology versus social dynamics, all that stuff. And we're really trying to advance scientific theory. And oftentimes, as pointy-headed science geeks, we try to understand this, and this is where we sink our teeth into. And classically in fisheries management, we're talking tactical management. You know, where we're revising stock assessments, we're providing yield adjustments, attack adjustments, whatever, and the reference points associated with that. And in an EBFM context, we're looking at not only direct impacts on target stocks, but other critters as well, as you see listed there. And this is very specific. What is scenarios? What is the tax for next year? What is the quota for the next couple of years, something like that. And it's binding in scope. And we're familiar with these. The challenge, I think, with an EBFM consideration is the strategic management advice. And this really is where we're trying to assess these biomass trade-offs and explore system-level emergent properties. How does the system function as a whole? Maybe evaluate these different steady states. I'm told on this coast there's a thing called the PDO on regime shifts and stuff like that. So anyway, things like that to consider. And really, the big things as Jake mentioned earlier this morning, these long-term recruitment bottlenecks. And these are much more generic or general what-if scenarios, and they're not so much, this is this year's quota, but they're, hey, is this feasible? Is this not feasible? They're bounding in scope. Now, here's my quote. Fisheries scientists give heuristic advice. Fisheries managers want tactical advice, and most of the time, strategic advice is what is needed. So the reason I flagged that is the types of models, the types of approaches that I'm going to show you here in the next few moments. Where are we going to apply them? What kinds of questions are we going to address them to? What does that advice do along the gradient of possibilities and questions that we have to address? So this is the gradient of possibilities. You can see we have, the classical single species stuff, all the way up to these messy pictures that Bill allowed us to do. And then, a range of things along here, and you can basically ignore ecosystem issues, and that happens. You can do multiple single species assessments in harmony. That's not e-harmony, that's just getting together and walking down the hall and making sure things are jiving with other folks. And what we're doing a lot, and I'm seeing more and more of, is adding basically other stuff, predation, habitat, whatever, into these assessments as another source of mortality, another source of removals, impacts to growth, whatnot. And then these multi-species assessments, aggregate assessments, and whole system models. And you can have Heurism at any place along here. Most of your tactical information is on this level, although there are a couple aggregate models that can give you tactical outputs. And then your strategic stuff tends to be more here in biophysics and so on. So I want to keep that in mind and then give you a few examples of what we're doing in the Northeast U.S., approaches we're trying, and to be very frank and forthright about how well not only we feel that we're doing scientifically, but how well our management institutions and those structures are taking up the information to give you that perspective. So this is a quote to remind me that I'm not going to talk about what we're doing. So you've read it by now, I guess. So, all right. One of the things is single species add-ons. And basically, this is where we're making our hay. We're doing a lot of these, and we're incorporating these into stock assessments. Some of you have reviewed these for us, where we're looking at primarily predation type things, more environmental cues, and really that's critical for forest species. But the two key points here is it's still pretty slow uptake kinetics in the overall management process. It takes a long time to vet the model, to have people like Jake come in and kick the tires and say, you can be considered this or that. And then the other thing is, generally speaking, I think probably categorically, if you look at this example, something that Bill Overholt and I did a while ago, where we were projecting at the time, if you just do a standard assessment and ignore predation, you get one answer. When you include predation, you have lower yield by a factor of 10–15%. And that's not always the most popular thing to say. So that might be why it hasn't plugged in. So let me run through, probably the bulk of my examples would be the single species add-ons, extended stock assessment models, minimum realistic models, whatever you want to call them, but stuff that we're probably more familiar with a few other elements. And here's an example again that Bill Overholt and I did. And what you can see, we recreated some history going back to the late 50s, and fishing mortality was whacking these species until we had the EEZ established and kind of kicked out the foreign fleet. Coincident with that, there was a lot of other groundfish and so on, and the mortality, predation mortality on herring was also high. And those two, that joint mortality, kind of knocked down the stock, and it was took a long time to recover, and it didn't start recovering until the later mid-90s or so, I should say. And what you see now currently is as you look through this trajectory and as we've projected even further, the predation mortality is at least 2 to 3 times higher than the fishing mortality. And we often have been doing these assessments and not including this, and yet this is a huge source of removal from mortality. It kind of dawned on us that we probably ought to do that. But again, bringing it into the process has been slow and challenging. Another example, I think you were at this one, but the Pandalis shrimp, northern shrimp in our Gulf of Maine system, Pandalis borealis, has a model, and they were running this model here, what am I allowed to say, puke green? Anyway, this green line here was the model with a mortality of 0.25, and we came in with this purple line right here that was effectively saying, look, let's take our data, empirical data, run it through a simple model, and calculate how much was removed by predators that at a minimum hadn't been in the ecosystem. And it was 4 or 5 times higher than what the model was estimating. Again, not a real popular thing to do. But ultimately what we said was, hey, let's maybe run the model with a mortality of 0.5 or 0.6. And it tended to then match up with an empirical backstopping to what we thought was going on with this stock. And we couldn't understand with this model why the stock was going up, where in fact, when we had this accounting for this higher biomass that was out there, it helped us understand the dynamics of it. So this has been through a SARC and so forth. Another example is including menhaden with and without predation. It's just backcasting. What you see is without predators, there was a lot less that was out there than if you include predators in a backcasting sense, which also has huge ramifications for reference points and projections and so on. But the other thing, I think this is age 1, when you get to age 2, and we have to be very forthright about this, who cares? And so they grow out of that predation window. So we're looking at that. Here's another one we looked at with Loligo squid, long-fin squid. And you take the ratio of B to BMSY, and you don't have predators. And, it's not doing great, but more than not, it's above the reference point. When you add in predation and account for the fact that there's other removals, we're not looking as good. And again, trying to get this into the process without upsetting the apple cart and so forth has been a challenge. But we're doing this just to show proof of concept research model, run through, and we're trying to step through it in baby steps ultimately so that this can be taken up. I do mention this is some work John Hare has been doing. We've taken an IPCC model, stepped it down globally to, I think it's some estuary near Virginia, not the Chesapeake, but a subsidiary of that, and then plug that into a stock recruitment model as a function of temperature, and that's actually pretty well estimated and projectionable, and then you link that to some of the spawning biomass benchmarks from this and make some projections as well. So we're beginning to include all that. We also have multi-species models, again, mainly emphasizing predation and how that changes things. One of them is an MSVPA that has a lot of arrows and critters in it, but more importantly, it's been through a formal review for one region, and we've got plans for another review. And again, it's a multi-year process to present these models, have people kick the tires, look under the hood, see how we need to adapt it, and then review not only the model, but then the application of the model to a particular situation. But here's probably one point, and this is for Atlantic mackerel. What I can tell you is M2, predation mortality, is age variant, is time variant, and it's not 0.2. So, never mind. The other thing is we have a multi-species and aggregate production model, and we had a recent GARM process, a ground fish assessment review, and really this is the same kind of a modeling approach as you would for single species, but we're doing it now for groups of species, ignoring the fact that they're species, but they're functionally similar or taxonomically similar or caught in the same year, etc. And we've got a whole host of models that simulate and actually do fitting and provide context for other assessments and allow us to do scenario testing, and we're beginning to include that in those assessments. And here's one example where you run a model, this model, and you get basically everybody kind of at their carrying capacity or BMSY, whatever you want to call it. And, you know, there's some trophic partitioning. And then you go in and you whack the pelagics, these critters, the planktivores, and not only do you get some compensation by shrimp amphipod eaters, which have some diet, and the bentivores, which are sucking up some of the energy. More importantly, you forego yield for the entire system. And that's an important outcome of this that we begin to look at. Another approach is we've actually fit to our catch and survey data of an aggregate model that we actually use in that context to answer the question, can you have BMSY for 19 or 30 whatever stocks simultaneously, and what would the aggregate MSY and BMSY be for those? And we're fitting those. Here's an example to show how the fit and the survey actually aren't too far off. Another thing, we've had a project that had several energy buddies. We used several food web models. There's one famous out here. Maybe you've heard of it, EcoPath, but there are a couple others. Love you, Billy. The Eco Network and a couple others. And really, we actually use that as part of the ARM. We're building dynamic models off of this, and we're using this as part of our trade-off analysis. So you go in and you whack, you know, a couple of these nodes, what happens to the rest of the energy in the system? How does it get redistributed? 10 minutes, okay. And then also it helps us understand the structure and function and look at this from a static snapshot, but also building the dynamic to see where energy flows in terms of fairly simplistic operating model in an MSC context. The other thing that Bill Overholtz and a couple of us have done is we've taken the results from EMAX, we've made a homegrown dynamic model that actually goes through and expresses all these different relationships. It's a kind of a donor control approach, a little different than what is typically done. And we've gone through and we've tested about 30 different scenarios, and ranging from climate change to overfishing to simultaneous things, protected species, and so on. And what we're doing with that is also setting this up to provide context for other things in a dynamic way so that we can then go back and test how different outcomes or scenarios would play out. The last one is ATLANTIS. These are full-blown ecosystem simulations, and Tony mentioned this morning, so I won't go into too much detail. We're pretty well validated, and those of you who've never used ATLANTIS, if you do choose to do that, there's a support group I recommend you use. But more importantly, it's a systemic tool. We use it primarily for strategic type things, and there's about 3 or 4 levels of validation before you can get into the scenario testing, and we're just about there. But we're using it even in those calibrations or validations to do these virtual perturbations. And this is another operating model we would intend to use for MSC, primarily not only for EBFM, but EBM multi-sector. And this is the value of that approach. And here's our 30 boxes with our depth. And you can get the outputs and look at in a particular place, the time trajectory, and look at all these things, and then hit play and look at it 30 years later, et cetera, et cetera. We also are taking the empirical data that we have from our fishery dependent, independent information and our models, and we're just trying to come up with creative ways to look at patterns and processes to determine how all this fits together. And ultimately, we're trying to define ecosystem overfishing. I don't know if we can, certainly we're not mandated to, but we might be mandated to at some point, and that's one of the things that keeps us going in this. So basically, there's a lot of modeling efforts. We're working at all ends of this gradient. A lot of these are still R&D things, but some of them have actually been through a formal process, most of which are more towards the single species with additions to them. But the big point is we're still trying to take a look at things systemically all at once. And we're not as data limited as perhaps other parts of the world, but we've still, through this process, the data gap identification keeps showing up. That's been valuable. So yeah, we're still developing stuff. Yeah, this is a great quote from the spotted owl controversy here. Make a joke about tasting like time, or it might have been someone, so I won't say that. Thank you. We're doing MSCs, marine procedures, management procedures, and IAs, and basically everything I showed you the past few minutes is fair game for an operating model. And, you know, the observations, your objectives, you plug through this, particularly with integrated assessments, and then how does it play out, what are your management's performance measurements, and so forth. And we're beginning to, as gently as we can, try to suggest this might be a way forward to get us off the assessment treadmill. Every year we have to do a bunch of assessments. Maybe we can slow down a bit. The other thing is we're really emphasizing education and outreach. We have a glossy, shiny glossy, that we published that has really been useful to get everyone in the system to understand, you know, just general principles ranging from stakeholders, industry, and managers. The other thing, perhaps a little more technical, is we've got ecosystem advisory reports, ecosystem status reports, and these are on the order of 20 or 30 pages. We're just now pulling these together to kind of highlight some quick-hitting things, major forcers and drivers, major responses. There is some socioeconomic outputs, and then integrative measures and how all this ties together, trying to keep a quick hit, quick view, and look at it from that unique kind of product perspective that you might typically get from a science angle. Without going into too much detail, we have been engaging our two councils and our state commission at various committees, various formal and informal things. Just a couple weeks ago, I gave a presentation at the Mid-Atlantic, and we're helping them develop fishery ecosystem plans. Another thing is a marine resource education partnership. We go in with about 30 members of the fishing industry, a few NGO folks, and we sit around the table very informal, and we just talk about these concepts. And I love that. It's been really valuable because it's non-threatening. We're not making a decision, and it's just a way to share ideas and make those connections. It's been really valuable for us to interact with the industry that way. And then more formally, we've had a ton of other meetings, and then our regional office as well, where we're really trying to establish some working groups, collaborations more formally that will keep this ball rolling. And then, you know, people that are smarter than us, we bring in and steal their ideas. So, we just reorganized at our center less than a year ago. We developed this new program, and we did this to establish an integrated effort for all of the things our center does. And you know, most science centers collect things from soup to nuts, oceanography, fish, protected species, everything. But oftentimes it's a challenge to integrate those. And we've been really fortunate to be able to do this here recently, a group to that end. And our goal is really to develop these products from an EBFM perspective and to help people work together, particularly to take this total system view than just a species-centric view. So there's a lot we have left to do. Let me give you, how many time do I have? A couple minutes here. Okay. Let me give you some technical suggestions or plans that we have for implementation. One is, if you're going to optimize or change these stock assessments, I think predation mortality on forage species is a good place to make a lot of hay. And we're doing that. I think the other thing is exploring these environmental drivers on all the various things that can impact stocks as climate change begins to continue along is something that we're exploring. And then the trade-offs among species, we're trying furiously to stay, one step ahead of the curve to model all that stuff, because it's coming down. And then, we're big advocates of not just D models, but 3 or 4 models at one point to address a particular question as appropriate. And then the other thing is what do you do with this output? How do you handle strategic advice? I don't know. So we're engaging stakeholders and partners to figure that one out. From an institutional perspective, I think what I've seen over the past 5 to 6 years is this MSE framework or approach. It really is a pretty good way to go. And then plugging in or producing in that process these integrated products, static or IA, et cetera. And then we're realizing that we need to continue the outreach and engagement at levels, multiple levels than we have before, and working within the structures formally to do that. And then, I don't know if you can see it here, but in the Lord of the Rings, Gandalf says, keep it simple, keep it safe. Kind of. We're trying to simplify this and keep it as simple as possible and keep it safe in that it's non-threatening, it's familiar with a slight change. And I think there's value to that as opposed to we're going to change how we do this wholeheartedly. And I think the odds for buying are a lot better if we follow Gandalf's advice here. So this is a great quote. I wish Detroit would remember this now. Let me conclude with this. We get all these models, we get all this complexity. I really firmly believe, let's go with what we got, let's keep it pragmatic, and let's move forward. And I think it actually is easy as pie. Let me show you how. We can go out and measure how big is the pie, how productive is that ecosystem. Let's take the slice out for flipper, a protected species or habitat of a particular concern. And then let's figure out how everybody can get a slice of what is available. And then, these are the different fleets, and everybody needs to have a piece on their plate. And we have all these different fisheries management tools, programs, and one and stuff. So I really think we can do that. It's just a matter of making sure we're taking the whole system into account and maybe using these tools in unique combinations that we had before. And I hope we do that and not end up looking the way we always do, like this. So thank you very much.
I want to know if that's a picture of Jason at the bottom there. So, any questions for Jason? I have a question. You offered the notion that we should be offering strategic advice.
Yeah.
And then you provided us a very impressive sort of recount of the various modeling exercises that you're involved in. Could you provide me some examples of how those models have provided strategic advice to decision makers?
Yes.
And also, I guess I'd like to also point out is, do you ever see any limitations of the use of modeling?
Yes. I think you'd like me to elaborate. The first question is an example of how you take strategic advice and use that. One example is we had our recent GARM about a year ago, Ground Fish Assessment Review. We assessed the status of 19 stocks. And we then came in, 3 or 4 of us as an extra group, and I think we had 5 different modeling approaches. And what we were saying was, what is the aggregate BMSY versus let's take all the outputs from those single species assessments and add them up and compare them. And our number, unsurprisingly, was lower than the sum. And we said, hey, we don't know exactly what to do that, but this is context you all need to be aware of. And when we went back through that, it actually helped some parameter choices and some changes when we, after we got our initial data meeting and preliminary as we walked through that process. When we came back and did the finals, the updates actually closed that gap. So that's one example among several like that. And the second question was, are there limitations to these models? And absolutely, and the reason I mentioned Heurism and tactical or strategic is sometimes models are used inappropriately for the wrong question or wrong kind of advice. And that's a limitation that I think we want to be very careful regarding in a particular model. We have a report that came out last year from our National System Modeling Workshop that goes through that. Even Plang has a report with FAO, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of that in detail. Yeah.